The dining room at Birchwood Grill smelled like garlic bread and candle wax, and my sister's voice cut through both of them like a blade through warm butter. $7,200, Mari. That is not a big ask. That is nothing to you. I was holding a water glass I had not touched in 10 minutes, and I remember the ice had gone soft and round at the edges, the way it does when you forget you are holding something at all. 12 people sat around that long table. My mother, small and folded into her cardigan at the far end. My brother-in-law, Grant, jaw tight, eyes on his plate. My nephew, Dylan, 19 years old, staring at me with an expression I would spend the next several weeks trying to name. And my sister, Deborah, chin lifted, diamond studs catching the low restaurant light, waiting for me to say yes, the way she had waited for me to say yes for 30 years. "It is for Ashlyn's Sweet 16, Deb said when I did not answer fast enough. "The venue needs the deposit by Friday. I already told them we were confirmed." "You told them you were confirmed," I repeated, "before you asked me." "Because I knew you would say yes." She smiled when she said it, the particular smile she had used on me since we were girls, the one that assumed compliance the way other people assume gravity. "You always do. That is what you are for, Mari." That is what you are for. I want you to remember that sentence, because it comes back later. And when it comes back, it does not belong to her anymore. I set the water glass down very carefully, the way you set down something you are afraid you might otherwise throw. "I will look into it," I said. "Look into it?" Deb laughed, and it was not a warm laugh. It was the laugh she gave waiters who brought the wrong side dish. "It is a bank transfer, not a merger. You manage Dad's trust, Mom's trust. You have the checkbook. You have always had the checkbook. What exactly is there to look into?" I felt every eye at that table find me at once, the way heat finds the coldest point in a room. My mother's eyes were the ones that hurt the most, because she was looking at me with the soft, apologetic confusion she wore more and more these days, as if she wanted to help and could not remember how, or what the argument was even about. "I will call you tomorrow," I said. "You will wire it tonight," Deb said, and her voice had dropped the performance and gone flat and certain. The voice of someone who has never once in her life been told no and kept the receipt. "Because if you do not, I am telling every single person in this family exactly what kind of aunt refuses to pay for her own niece's 16th birthday. The spinster who has nothing else to spend her money on and will not even spend it on family." The table went quiet, in the specific way a restaurant table goes quiet when a family fight becomes visible to strangers 2 booths over. I watched Grant's ears turn red. I watched Dylan's hand tighten around his fork. I watched my mother reach for her water with a hand that shook slightly, not from anger, but from whatever slow erosion had been happening inside her for the past 2 years that none of us said out loud yet. I did not raise my voice. I want to be honest with you about that, because in the version of this story Deb would tell later, I screamed at her in that restaurant. I made a scene. I embarrassed the family in public. None of that happened. What happened is that I folded my napkin, set it beside my plate, and I said 5 words. "I will call you tomorrow." Then I stood up, said goodnight to my mother, kissed the top of her head, and walked out into a parking lot slick with the first rain of a storm that had been building over the coast all afternoon. I sat in my car for 11 minutes before I started the engine. I did not cry. I want you to know that too, because for years I would have cried in that parking lot and called it processing and gone home and wired the money by morning because it was easier than being the villain in someone else's story about her own daughter's birthday party. But I did not cry that night. I opened my phone and I looked at a banking app I had not opened outside of the first of the month in 3 years. And I stared at the 7-digit account number belonging to the Calloway Family Trust, the account my late father had built with 40 years of hardware store receipts and Saturday deliveries and a wife he adored more than he ever knew how to say out loud. And 22 minutes after I left that restaurant, sitting in a wet parking lot with the rain drumming on the roof of my car like something trying to get in, I made one phone call. It was not to my sister. It was to a man named Mr. Pace at Meridian Trust, and by the time I hung up, the card my sister had been quietly abusing for 3 years no longer worked at all. She did not know that yet. Nobody at that table knew that yet. My mother did not know it, Grant did not know it, Dylan did not know it. And Deborah Hargrove, mid-sentence, mid-triumph, 3 days out from her daughter's 16th birthday party, absolutely did not know it. She was already telling her friends how generous her sister had finally learned to be. She had no idea what was coming. To understand why I made that call and why it took me 31 years to make it, you have to go back further than that restaurant. You have to go back to a hardware store on Route 9 and a man named Walter Calloway and the particular way our family decided, sometime around 1994, exactly which daughter mattered. My father built Calloway Supply out of a cinder block building with one loading dock and a hand-painted sign. And he built it slowly, the way men build things when they do not trust banks and do trust their own 2 hands. I grew up in the back office of that store, doing his invoices in a green ledger before I was old enough to drive, because I was the one who liked numbers, the one who could look at a column of figures and see the story hiding inside it. Deb, 4 years older than me, liked something else entirely. She liked being looked at. She liked walking into a room and having the room reorganize itself around her, the way a room does for a certain kind of woman, the kind who never has to ask twice. Our parents noticed the difference in us early, and they did what a lot of parents do without meaning any harm by it. They built 2 different stories about their 2 different daughters, and once a story like that gets told enough times at enough dinner tables, it stops being a description and starts being a cage. Deb was the beautiful one. I was the reliable one. Deb was the one who was going places. I was the one who would always be there. Nobody ever said it cruelly. That is the part people do not understand about this kind of family wound. Nobody sat me down and told me I was less than my sister. They simply behaved, every single day, for 30 years, as if it were the most obvious fact in the world. The way you behave as if the sky is blue without ever having to say the sentence out loud. I was 9 when Deb got a jewelry box for her birthday, and I got a calculator for mine, because my mother said, sweetly, without a trace of malice, "Well, you actually use it, honey." I was 14 when Deb got the good car, a used but shining little coupe, because Deb was going to need to make an impression, while I got my father's old truck because I was sensible and would not mind. I was 22 when Deb got married in a ballroom with 200 guests and an ice sculpture of a swan, and I sat at table 14 near the kitchen doors and gave a toast that made everyone cry, because I have always been good with words, even when nobody was particularly interested in hearing mine, outside of a wedding toast or a eulogy. I never married. I want to say that plainly, without shame, because shame is exactly what my sister wanted me to feel about it for 3 decades. I had one long relationship in my 30s that ended quietly and without villains, And after that, I built a life that suited me. I became a bookkeeper and eventually an enrolled agent, handling taxes and small business accounts for half the town, including, eventually, my own father's hardware store. And then, after he sold it and folded the proceeds into a trust for my mother's future care, the Calloway Family Trust itself. My father made me the sole trustee 3 years ago, in a lawyer's office with wood paneling and a box of tissues on the desk, 6 weeks before cancer took him faster than any of us were ready for. I remember that meeting the way you remember weather. Rosalind Kim, our family's elder law attorney, sat across from my father with a folder open between them, and my father, gray and thin by then, but still entirely himself, looked at me across that table and said the sentence that would end up meaning more than he could have known. "Mari sees what's actually there," he told Rosalind. "Not what she wishes was there, not what looks good on paper, what's actually there. That's why it's her." Deb was in the waiting room during that conversation. She had been told there was a trust meeting and had assumed, reasonably enough, given how our family had always been arranged, that she would be the one signing things. When she found out afterward that I had been named sole trustee over roughly $1.1 million in liquidated business assets, investments, and the house, earmarked first and entirely for my mother's care, with the residual to be split between us only after my mother's needs were fully met, something in my sister's face changed that I did not fully understand until much later. It was not sadness. It was recalibration. Deb did not say much that day. She hugged our father, thanked Rosalind for her time, and drove home. It was 3 weeks later, at a diner over coffee neither of us finished, that she said the thing that I now understand was the opening move in a 3-year campaign. "It makes sense," she said, stirring sugar into coffee she did not drink. "You've always been better with the boring stuff. I'll help you with the emotional side. Mom's going to need someone to actually be there, you know? Not just someone managing a spreadsheet." I did not push back on that framing, because I did not yet understand that it was a framing, a story being built brick by brick, in which I would be recast as the cold accountant, and Deb would be recast as the warm, present daughter, regardless of who actually showed up on a Tuesday afternoon when our mother could not remember whether she had taken her blood pressure medication. My father died 6 weeks after that meeting, in early spring, on a morning so ordinary it still surprises me when I remember it. Dylan was 17 then, quiet, watchful, the kind of teenager who notices everything and says almost nothing. He sat next to me at the funeral, not next to his mother, and afterward, in the church parking lot, he hugged me so hard and so long that my own mother had to gently pull him off so we could get in the cars. "Grandpa liked you best," Dylan told me, at 14, 3 years before that, at a 4th of July barbecue where nobody else was paying attention to either of us. "Don't tell Mom I said that." I never did tell her, but I carried it, the way you carry a small, warm stone in your pocket on a cold day, taking it out sometimes just to remember it is there. That is who Dylan became to me over the following years. Not a nephew I saw twice a year and forgot about. An anchor. A reason on the hardest days of managing a trust for a mother who was slowly disappearing, and a sister who saw that trust as a faucet she was entitled to turn. To remember that not everyone in that family had learned the same lesson about what I was for. The trust was meant to be simple. My mother's care first, always, in full, without compromise. Reasonable distributions to Deb and me after that. Agreed upon jointly, documented, modest. Rosalind Kim had built in a clause, at my father's insistence, allowing limited authorized user access on one linked debit card for immediate caregiving expenses. capped at $300 per transaction without prior trustee approval. Specifically so that if my mother had an emergency and I was unreachable, Deb, who lived 12 minutes from our mother while I lived 40, could act quickly. It was a gesture of trust. My father built it, I now understand, hoping that giving Deb even a small piece of responsibility might soften the thing he could feel calcifying in her. The resentment of watching her younger sister get named guardian of the family's entire financial future. It did not soften anything. It became, over 3 years, the crack in the foundation that my sister slowly, patiently, expertly widened into a door. At first, the overages were small enough to explain away. $400 for a caregiver agency, a little over the cap, because Mom needed extra hours that week. $600 for a wheelchair ramp contractor. Urgent, you were in a meeting. I approved them after the fact, tired, generous, wanting to believe the story my sister was telling about herself. The story where she was the daughter who showed up. I did not learn until much later how few of those hours had actually been logged. I did not learn until much later that the wheelchair ramp had never been built at all. But that discovery, the real one, the one that changes everything, does not happen yet. First, you need to understand what those 3 years actually looked like from the inside. Sitting across from my sister at every holiday table, listening to her tell a version of our family in which she was generous and I was withholding, in which she showed up and I merely wrote checks, in which the daughter who managed $1 million trust with meticulous care was somehow the cold one, and the daughter who could not remember her own mother's pharmacy phone number was somehow the warm one. It took me 3 years to see the shape of what she was building. It took one restaurant dinner, one $7,200 demand, and one phone call in a rainstorm for me to finally stop pretending I could not see it. But she still did not know that yet. Nobody did. And that ignorance, that particular quiet certainty my sister carried into her daughter's Sweet 16 preparations, was the most valuable thing I had. The months after that Route 9 diner conversation settled into a rhythm I did not recognize as dangerous at the time. Mostly because danger rarely announces itself with anything as dramatic as a slap or a shattered vase. It announces itself in small overages. It announces itself in a Tuesday phone call that starts with, "Hey, quick thing," and ends 11 minutes later with $400 leaving an account meant to keep our mother safe. Every family has a keeper of the peace, the person who smooths things over so the holidays keep happening, so nobody has to sit with the discomfort of an unresolved conflict for longer than a car ride home. In our family, that had always been me. I was the daughter who did not raise her voice. I was the daughter who absorbed the joke about the spinster accountant at Thanksgiving and laughed along, because laughing along was cheaper than the alternative, which was becoming, in front of relatives who only saw us twice a year, the difficult one. Deb understood this about me better than I understood it about myself. She built her entire strategy on it. The first real test came 8 months after my father's funeral, at my mother's 77th birthday, a small gathering at my mother's house with a store-bought cake and 12 candles, because Deb said counting out 77 individually was excessive. I remember standing in my mother's kitchen, washing dishes because it gave my hands something to do, when Deb came in holding her phone. "I need $380 for Ashlyn's dance recital costume," she said, as if she were reading me a grocery list. "The recital's Saturday. I already ordered it. I just need you to release it from the account." "That's not a caregiving expense, Deb," I said. I kept my voice even. I had learned, by then, that even keeping my voice was the only weapon I had that she could not immediately turn into a story about me. "It's for your niece." Deb set the phone down on the counter, hard enough that it rattled against the granite. "You want her to go on stage in last year's costume? In front of the whole studio? Is that the aunt you want to be?" I dried a plate slowly. The trust is for Mom's care. Recital costumes come out of a different conversation. "Everything comes out of a different conversation with you," Deb snapped. "Dad would have just paid it. Dad never made me beg." That was not true, and some small, quiet part of me knew even then that it was not true. That our father had in fact made Deb wait for things her entire life, precisely because he understood, in his plain hardware store way, that a person who never has to wait for anything never learns the difference between a want and a need. But grief makes people rewrite history in whatever shape is most useful to them. And Deb had rewritten our father into a man who would have handed her anything, simply because it made her current demand feel less like an entitlement and more like a birthright interrupted only by me. I paid the $380 out of my own account that week, quietly, without telling her, because I did not want my niece standing on a stage in a costume that did not fit, while her mother made a scene about who was to blame. I never told Deb I had done that. I never told anyone, actually, until now. It was not generosity toward her. It was protection of Ashlyn, who was 12 that year and had absolutely nothing to do with any of it. That pattern repeated itself in different shapes for the better part of 3 years. A caregiving emergency that turned out to be a family vacation to Cancun. 6 days at an all-inclusive resort that Deb billed to the trust card as respite care coordination travel. A phrase so absurd that I remember reading it on the statement and laughing out loud, alone in my office, the particular laugh that has no humor in it at all. $9,800, spread across 2 transactions to stay under a threshold she had apparently learned about from somewhere. A leased SUV, $14,300 over the first year, justified as transport for Mom's medical appointments, despite the fact that my mother, at that stage, was still driving herself twice a week to the senior center and had been to exactly 1 medical appointment that required assistance, which Deb had not attended. Private tutoring for Ashlyn's math class, framed as cognitive support services, in a reimbursement note that used almost the exact clinical language from an occupational therapy invoice for my mother, submitted the same month, as if Deb had simply copied phrasing from one document to another and hoped nobody would ever place the two side by side. I want to be honest about something here, because it matters for understanding how something like this continues for 3 years without the person managing the money noticing sooner. I was not stupid, and I was not careless. I was busy, and I was grieving, and I was managing 40 other clients' books along with my mother's medical decline. And every single time I noticed an irregularity, my sister met it with the same weapon, deployed with surgical precision. "That's what you're for, Mari." She said it so many times over those 3 years that I stopped hearing the individual words and started only hearing the tone underneath them. A tone that assumed, the way you assume the sun will rise, that my role in this family was to make things easy for everyone else, and that any hesitation on my part was not caution, was not diligence, was not the literal legal duty I held as trustee, but was, simply, selfishness dressed up in a green ledger. Dylan saw more of it than I realized at the time. He was 16, then 17, then 18, growing quieter each year the way sensitive kids do in houses where the loudest person in the room sets the emotional temperature for everyone else. He started texting me sometimes, small things, nothing accusatory, nothing that would have gotten him in trouble if his mother had seen his phone. "Mom bought a new couch," he texted me once. No other context. The week after Deb had told me the trust needed to cover an emergency plumbing repair at our mother's house. I did not understand at the time what he was trying to tell me. I thought he was just making conversation. It took me a long time to understand that Dylan had been quietly, carefully, leaving me a trail of breadcrumbs for over a year, because he did not have the language yet to say the actual sentence, which was, "My mother is lying to my aunt, and I do not know how to stop her. And I am scared of what happens to Grandma if nobody does." My mother, in the meantime, was declining in ways that had nothing to do with money and everything to do with the ordinary cruelty of time. She had a small stroke in the spring of the second year. Mild, the doctor said, but enough to leave a faint tremor in her right hand and a new fog that came and went depending on the day, sometimes sharp as ever in the morning and gone somewhere distant by 4 in the afternoon. Her neurologist, a careful, kind man named Dr. Osei, began using words like mild cognitive impairment, and then, more quietly the following year, words like early stage. I remember sitting in my mother's kitchen on an ordinary Tuesday, watching her try 3 times to remember the name of the show she used to watch every night for 20 years, and feeling something harden in my chest that had nothing to do with numbers on a bank statement. This is what the money was for. Not vacations, not leased SUVs, not costumes and tutoring and a new couch justified as an emergency repair. It was for this. For a woman who built 40 years of a marriage out of Saturday deliveries and hand-painted signs, and who deserved, at the end of her life, to be cared for by people who were not quietly bleeding her safety net dry to fund a lifestyle 2 towns over. I did not know yet how deep the wound went. I only knew, sitting in that kitchen, that something in me had shifted, permanently and quietly, the way tectonic plates shift long before anyone on the surface feels the tremor. I started keeping better records, not because I suspected fraud yet, not in those words, but because some old instinct, the same instinct my father had trusted enough to hand me a trust worth over $1 million, told me that the story I was being told about where the money was going no longer matched the story the numbers themselves were quietly telling. That instinct would prove itself right in the middle of a freezing rain in November, in a hallway outside a memory care facility, when a woman at the front desk told me, gently and apologetically, that my mother's deposit for expanded care had never actually been paid. But before that hallway, before that freezing rain, there was a shoebox. It sat on the top shelf of my mother's hallway closet, an old shoebox with a rubber band gone brittle with age, filled with receipts my mother had, out of 40 years of habit as a small business owner's wife, never learned to stop keeping. I found it while looking for her old insurance card one Sunday afternoon, and something about the sheer physical weight of it, receipts spilling out in a soft paper landslide when the rubber band finally gave, made me sit down right there on the hallway floor and start sorting. I did not go looking for what I found. I want to be clear about that, because there is a difference between a woman who goes hunting for evidence against her sister and a woman who is simply trying to organize her mother's insurance paperwork and stumbles, instead, into a pattern she cannot unsee once she has seen it. The first thing that caught my eye was a receipt from a furniture store, dated the same week Deb had told me about the plumbing emergency. $1,400, a sofa, delivered to Deb's address, not our mother's. I set it aside, telling myself there was probably an explanation, the way I had told myself there was probably an explanation for 3 years running. The second thing was a folded printout, a reimbursement request form from the trust, one I recognized because I had approved dozens like it, This one requesting $620 for medical equipment, per Carol's request, with my mother's signature at the bottom. I stared at that signature for a long time. My mother's real signature, the one I had watched her sign birthday cards and grocery lists and my father's anniversary presents with for 50 years, had a particular looping C, an open, generous letter that took up more space than it needed to, exactly like her personality before the stroke narrowed her handwriting the way it narrowed so many other things. This signature was tighter, careful. The C closed at the top instead of open. It was a signature trying very hard to look like my mother's signature, and almost succeeding, the way a forgery almost succeeds when the forger has seen the real thing many times, but has never actually held the pen the way the original signer holds it. I did not want to believe what I was looking at. I sat on that hallway floor with 62 years of my mother's life spilled out in paper around me, and I told myself, for a good 10 minutes, that I was overreacting, that stress does science things to a person's handwriting, that my mother had been tired that day, that there was an explanation. Then I found the second form, and the third. 6 reimbursement requests over 18 months, each one bearing that same tight, careful, wrong version of my mother's signature, each one requesting an amount just over the $300 authorized user cap, each one accompanied by a note explaining an emergency that, when I cross-referenced it against the caregiver agency's actual logged visits, the medical appointment calendar Dr. Osei's office kept, and my mother's own increasingly sparse but still legible day planner, simply had not happened. I sat on that floor until the light outside the hallway window went from afternoon gold to evening blue, and I did not cry, and I did not call my sister screaming, and I did not do any of the things a person does in the movies when they discover a betrayal like this. I did something much quieter and much more dangerous to the person who had built this particular house of cards. I photographed every single page. My phone's camera roll filled with images of my mother's handwriting, real and imitated, side by side. And I remember the strange, clinical calm that settled over me as I worked. The same calm I imagine a surgeon must feel once the first incision is already made and there is no longer any use pretending the operation has not begun. Underneath the 6th form, tucked flat against the bottom of the shoebox where it had clearly settled over months of receipts being added on top of it, I found something that had nothing to do with money at all. And it was that object, more than any single dollar figure, that made my hands go still. It was a photograph, a small square print with a white border gone soft and yellow at the edges. My father standing in front of the hardware store on the day he first opened it, one arm slung around my mother's shoulders, both of them laughing at something outside the frame that neither of us would ever know the answer to now. On the back, in my mother's real handwriting, the loose, open-looped C, unmistakable even in a single initial, she had written a date and 4 words. Walter's big day, ours too. I sat on that hallway floor holding that photograph for a long time, longer than I had spent on any single reimbursement form, because it reminded me, in a way the spreadsheet numbers never could, exactly what all of this had actually been built to protect. Not a balance sheet, not a line of credit. A woman who had once stood laughing in front of a cinder block building with her whole life still ahead of her. A woman whose handwriting on the back of a 40-year-old photograph could still, even now, tell the truth about who she was, even when someone else's careful forgery of that same hand could not. I photographed the back of that picture too. I do not know exactly why, except that some instinct told me I would want it later, not as evidence for a bank or a judge, but as evidence for myself, on the nights ahead when I would need reminding why any of this mattered enough to risk the only family I had left. Further down, near the bottom of the pile, I found something else that made the shape of the pattern sharper still. A handwritten note, not typed, not on a trust reimbursement form, just a torn half-sheet of notebook paper, in Deb's handwriting this time. A grocery list on one side and, on the other, a few practice loops of a signature. My mother's signature. Practiced, over and over, 6 or 7 attempts down the page, each one a little closer to the real thing than the one before it, the way a student practices a spelling word before a test. I want to be honest about what that particular piece of paper did to me, because I think it matters more than the dollar amounts, more than the forms, more than any of it. A person can talk themselves into believing a single overage was an honest mistake. A person can even talk themselves into believing 6 overages, spread across 18 months, were simply carelessness compounding on itself. But a torn half-sheet of practice signatures does not happen by accident. It requires a decision, made at some kitchen table on some ordinary evening, to sit down and rehearse deceiving a bank, and, by extension, deceiving an elderly woman who trusted her own daughter enough to never once check what she was actually signing. I sat with that scrap of paper in my hand and felt something in me finish the work grief had started 3 years earlier when my father died. It was not the anger I expected. It was quieter than anger, and colder, and it did not need to shout to make itself understood. It simply reorganized, permanently, the story I had been telling myself about my sister, the story where her worst behavior was thoughtlessness, where her cruelty at family dinners was simply Deb being Deb, a lifelong habit rather than a deliberate strategy. Thoughtlessness does not practice a signature 7 times on the back of a grocery list. Only intention does that. I photographed the practice sheet last, holding my phone steady even though my hand, I noticed distantly, was not entirely steady itself. Outside the hallway window, the last of the afternoon light had gone from gold to a deep, bruised blue. And somewhere down the street, a dog was barking at something, the ordinary sounds of an ordinary evening continuing on, completely unaware that inside this particular house, on this particular floor, an entire family's future had just quietly rearranged itself around one shoebox and a handful of receipts. I remember thinking, with a strange, detached clarity, that this was probably how it always happened, the moments that change everything arriving disguised as nothing at all. A Sunday afternoon, an insurance card, a rubber band that had simply gone brittle with age and finally let go. I thought about calling Rosalind Kim that very night, sitting right there on the floor with the shoebox still open in front of me. I decided against it, not out of hesitation, but out of the same instinct that had kept me quiet for 3 years without my fully understanding why. I wanted one more night to simply hold what I now knew, privately, completely, before I handed any part of it to another person, even someone I trusted as completely as I trusted Rosalind. I wanted, selfishly perhaps, to be the only one who understood the full shape of it for just a little while longer, the way you sometimes need to sit alone with devastating news before you can bear to watch it land on someone else's face, too. I gathered the receipts back into their original loose order as best I could remember it. The furniture store slip, the 6 reimbursement forms, the practice sheet, the photograph of my parents laughing in front of a building that no longer belonged to our family. And I held all of it for one more moment before doing what I had come into that closet to do in the first place, which was find an insurance card my mother had misplaced weeks earlier and needed for an appointment that Thursday. I found the insurance card, eventually, tucked inside an old church bulletin near the very bottom of the box, exactly where my mother had put it, in the specific, orderly way she filed things before her memory began to blur the edges of her own systems. I set it aside on the hallway floor, a small, ordinary object waiting to be useful again. and I looked at the shoebox one last time before closing it. I put the shoebox back exactly as I had found it, rubber band and all, because I understood, sitting there on that floor, that the single most valuable asset I now possessed was not the money in the trust. It was the fact that Deb still believed, completely and without a shadow of doubt, that I had not yet noticed a single thing. That night I drove home in the dark, through a light rain that had started somewhere around the county line, and I sat in my own kitchen with my laptop open and 3 years of bank statements arranged in careful rows, and I began, for the first time since my father died, to do the thing I had trained my entire adult life to do. I began to follow the money. The spreadsheet took me 11 nights to build properly, working after my regular clients had gone home for the day, the house quiet except for the low hum of the refrigerator and, some nights, the sound of rain against the window that seemed to follow me that whole autumn like a mood I could not shake. I am not exaggerating when I tell you that building that spreadsheet felt less like accounting and more like an excavation. Each column a layer of soil I had to carefully brush away to see what was actually buried underneath. I organized every transaction from the trust's linked accounts across 3 full years. Every authorized reimbursement, every card swipe, every wire, cross-referenced against 3 sources of ground truth: the caregiver agency's actual billed hours, Dr. Osei's actual appointment records, and, where I could get them, actual delivery addresses and dates from vendor receipts. I built categories: legitimate care expenses in one column, ambiguous but plausible expenses in another, and a third column, the one that grew longer every night, that I eventually labeled, in a moment of dark, private humor that I did not share with a single living soul, "Explain this to a judge." By night 4, that third column held $41,000. By night 7, it held $78,000. By the 11th night, when I finally closed the laptop somewhere past 1 in the morning, hands cold, coffee gone bitter and untouched beside me, the number sitting at the bottom of that column, the number representing funds pulled from my mother's care trust under false or fabricated pretenses over 3 years, was $118,400. I said that number out loud to my empty kitchen, just to hear whether it sounded as impossible spoken as it looked typed. It did not get smaller for having been spoken. If anything, it got heavier. The way a fact gets heavier once you have said it in your own voice, instead of just reading it silently. Because saying something out loud is a kind of commitment to believing it is true. $118,400. Not a single dollar of it, once I traced it fully, had gone to expanding my mother's care. If anything, the opposite. Because the trust's investment structure required a certain balance to stay in its higher yield account without triggering early withdrawal penalties on 2 of the CDs my father had set up, the drain Deb had created meant the fund meant to expand into full memory care when my mother eventually needed it was now nearly 9 months behind where it should have been. I did not fully understand the real-world consequence of that gap until the freezing rain in November, standing in a hallway at a facility called Fairhaven Memory Residences, listening to an admissions coordinator named Renata explain, kindly, apologetically, that the deposit required to hold my mother's spot in their expanded care wing, a spot Dr. Osei had told me, gently but firmly, my mother would likely need within the year, had not been paid, and that without it, the spot could not be guaranteed past the end of the month. I remember standing in that hallway in my wet coat, the rain still clinging to my shoulders, doing math in my head that had nothing to do with spreadsheets and everything to do with a woman who used to sing along to the radio in a hardware store parking lot while she waited for my father to close up on Saturdays. A woman who was now going to lose her place in a facility built for people exactly like her, because her other daughter had spent that money on a leased SUV and a sofa and a family vacation to Cancun. "There's been a misunderstanding," I told Renata, in a voice that came out steadier than I felt. "I am the trustee. I will have the deposit resolved by Friday." I want you to notice something about that moment, because it is the moment the story actually turns, even though nobody at that Sweet 16 dinner would know it for another several weeks. I did not go home and call my sister screaming. I did not confront her that night, fueled by adrenaline and freezing rain and grief. I went home, dried off, made a cup of tea I did not drink, and I called Rosalind Kim first thing the following morning. Rosalind had drafted my father's trust. She had sat across from him in that wood-paneled office with the box of tissues on the desk. She had watched him say, out loud, that I saw what was actually there instead of what looked good on paper. And she had spent 3 years since his death occasionally checking in with me over email about routine trust matters. Always brisk, always precise. Always exactly the kind of ally a person needs when the thing they are about to do is going to break a family apart, in order to save the one person in it who could no longer protect herself. "Send me everything," Rosalind said. Once I had walked her through the shoebox, the forged signatures, the spreadsheet, the $118,400, the deposit at Fairhaven that had never been paid. There was a long pause on her end of the line, the particular pause of a professional recalibrating how serious a situation actually is. "Marianne, I need you to understand something clearly before we go one step further. What you are describing, if the signatures are what you believe them to be, is not a family disagreement about spending. It is forgery. And it is very likely financial elder abuse under state law. That changes what our options are, and it changes what our obligations are." "Obligations," I repeated. "As trustee, you have a fiduciary duty to protect the trust's assets and your mother's interests, full stop, regardless of family relationships," Rosalind said. "If you knowingly allow this to continue after documenting it, you are not just permitting your sister to harm your mother. You are exposing yourself to liability for failing your role. This is bigger than a Sweet 16 deposit, Marianne. This is about whether your mother has a safe place to live in a year." I sat with that sentence for a long moment after we hung up. It is a strange thing to be told by an attorney in plain professional language that the quiet, private accounting you have been doing alone in your kitchen for 11 nights is not paranoia, is not overreacting, is not the cold spinster accountant being difficult about a family birthday party. It is duty. It is, in fact, the entire reason your father chose you, specifically you, out of his 2 daughters, to hold this responsibility. I thought about Dylan's texts. New couch. No other context. I understood them now, fully, for the first time, not as idle observations from a bored teenager, but as a scared young man trying, in the only language he had, to tell someone he trusted that something in his own house did not add up. I thought about my mother's tight, careful, wrong signature on those forms. A forgery close enough to fool a bank teller glancing at it for 3 seconds, but not close enough to fool a daughter who had watched the real one. The loose, generous, open-looped original for 50 years. I thought about the words that had been used against me for 3 decades at every dinner table in this family. Spinster, charity case, the unemployed one, even though I had never in my life been unemployed a single day. The bookkeeper. Boring, cold, withholding. And I thought, sitting alone in my kitchen with rain still falling somewhere outside past midnight, that every single one of those words had been chosen, deployed, and repeated by a woman who had spent 3 years forging her own mother's signature to fund a lifestyle her family's actual income could not support. That is what you are for, Mari. She had said it so many times I could hear it in her exact intonation without trying. She was right, as it turned out, just not in the way she meant it. I was, in fact, exactly what this family needed. She had simply never bothered to find out what that actually meant, until it was far too late for her to do anything about it. The next morning, before the sun had fully cleared the trees behind my house, I sat down with a legal pad and did something I had never once done in 3 years of managing my family's finances. I stopped thinking like a sister, and I started thinking like a trustee. Rosalind and I met 4 days later in her office, the same wood-paneled room where my father had signed the papers that started all of this. And for 2 hours, we walked through the trust document line by line. I want to explain some of this plainly because it matters for what happens later, and because understanding the actual mechanics of what I did is part of what makes this story true rather than fantasy. A revocable trust like the one my father established gives the trustee, and only the trustee, the authority to manage, distribute, and protect its assets according to the terms of the document and the trustee's fiduciary duty. That duty is not a suggestion. It is a legal obligation, enforceable in court, and a trustee who knowingly allows assets to be misappropriated after discovering the misappropriation can be held personally liable for failing to act. Rosalind made sure I understood that clearly, not to frighten me, but because she needed me to understand that what I was about to do was not optional cruelty. It was the job. It had always been the job. I had simply been avoiding the harder parts of it for 3 years because I did not want to be the villain in my sister's story. The authorized user card, Rosalind said, tapping the relevant clause with one manicured finger, was granted at your father's direction for immediate caregiving needs, capped at $300 per transaction. Nothing in this document obligates you to maintain that access indefinitely, especially once its terms have been repeatedly violated. As sole trustee, you have the unilateral authority to revoke it. Immediately, I said. Not a question, a confirmation. Immediately, Rosalind confirmed. 1 phone call to the bank and it is done. That sentence sat with me for the rest of that meeting, and honestly, for the rest of that week. 1 phone call. 3 years of forged signatures, siphoned funds, missed care deposits, family dinners where I absorbed insult after insult while quietly footing a recital costume out of my own pocket so my niece would not suffer for her mother's dishonesty. And the actual mechanism to stop it, the lever that had been sitting in my hand this entire time, required nothing more dramatic than a phone call. But Rosalind was careful to slow me down before I reached for my phone that same afternoon. Before you make that call, she said, we need to think about sequence. If you freeze the card the moment you learn about the forgeries, your sister will know immediately that you know. She will have time to build a defense, hide records, coach your mother, or worse, panic in a way that could hurt Carol emotionally before we have protections in place for her. We need Dr. Osei's formal assessment of your mother's cognitive status on record first, to establish, cleanly, that she was not capable of consistently authorizing these transactions in the way the forms claim. We need Fairhaven's deposit situation resolved quietly, so your mother's care is never actually at risk, regardless of how this plays out. And we need a clear paper trail establishing exactly when you discovered this, so no one can later claim you acted rashly, or worse, that you fabricated evidence out of some long-simmering sibling resentment. I understood what she was telling me. This could not simply be an explosion. It had to be a structure, built carefully, the way my father built that hardware store, one Saturday delivery at a time, so that when it finally stood, nobody, not Deb, not a judge, not a single relative at that long restaurant table, could knock it down with an accusation that I had acted out of jealousy or cruelty instead of duty. "How long," I asked, "before we can move?" Rosalind considered the calendar on her desk. "Realistically? 3 to 4 weeks, done properly." Ashlyn's Sweet 16 was in 3 weeks and 4 days. I remember the particular, quiet certainty that settled over me in that office, a feeling I had not experienced before in relation to my own family, not once in 52 years. It was not rage, though rage was certainly present, somewhere underneath, banked like a coal that had not yet caught. It was clarity. The dinner, the party, the stage my sister had already built for herself, the venue deposit, the guest list, the caterer, the very public celebration she had chosen of all possible moments to make her most aggressive demand yet. She had built her own stage. She simply did not know yet what was actually going to be performed on it. Over the following 3 weeks, I did not change a single thing about how I behaved toward my sister. This is, I think, the part of this story that surprises people most when I tell it, because everyone expects a dramatic confrontation to start with cold silence, with obvious distance, with the villain sensing something is wrong before the trap actually closes. That is not what disciplined preparation looks like. Disciplined preparation looks exactly like an ordinary Tuesday. I answered Deb's texts about the Sweet 16 with the same mild, non-committal responses I always had. I told her I was still working out the trust logistics for the $7,200, which was, in its own carefully worded way, entirely true. I attended one more family dinner at my mother's house, where Deb spent most of the meal describing the ballroom she had booked at a venue called Birchwood Manor, the caterer's tasting menu, the custom cake, a DJ who apparently specialized in what she called 16-year-old energy, whatever that meant. I nodded. I asked polite questions about the guest list. I complimented Ashlyn, genuinely, on how excited she seemed, because none of what was coming was ever, for one single second, about punishing a 16-year-old girl for her mother's choices. Underneath that ordinary surface, 3 things were happening at once, quietly, carefully, the way roots grow beneath a lawn that looks, from above, entirely undisturbed. The first was Dr. Osei's formal cognitive assessment. I arranged it under the simple, truthful framing of updating her care plan documentation for Fairhaven, which my mother, in one of her clearer weeks, agreed to without suspicion. The assessment confirmed what Rosalind and I needed on record: moderate cognitive impairment consistent with early-stage vascular dementia, sufficient to raise serious doubt about my mother's capacity to reliably understand and consent to complex financial reimbursement requests, particularly the specific and repeated pattern documented in the 6 forged forms. Dr. Osei, when I explained, carefully and without editorializing, what I had found in the shoebox, went very quiet on the phone for a moment. "Marianne," he said, "I need to tell you, as her physician, that if what you're describing is accurate, this is not simply a family financial dispute. This is a pattern that adult protective services would need to be made aware of, given her diagnosis." I had not fully considered, until that phone call, that this story might eventually involve more than a lawyer and a bank officer. Rosalind had mentioned it as a possibility during our first meeting, almost in passing, and I had let it pass too, because some part of me, even after everything, still recoiled at the idea of my sister facing anything as formal, as permanent, as an official elder abuse investigation. But Dr. Osei's obligation as a physician, once he had heard what I told him, was not optional either. Mandatory reporting laws exist for exactly this reason, and by the end of that week, a caseworker from the county's Adult Protective Services Division, a calm, unhurried woman named Nancy Ruiz, had opened a file with a number attached to it and had asked me, gently, to send her copies of everything Rosalind and I had assembled. I sat with that development longer than I sat with almost anything else in this entire ordeal. This was no longer a private family reckoning I could control the shape of. This was now, formally, a legal matter involving a state agency, my sister's forged signatures, and a physician's professional judgment that our mother could not be relied upon to consent to what had been done in her name. I called Nancy Ruiz back 2 days later, once I had absorbed what that meant. "I need to understand something," I told her. "What happens to my sister?" "That depends on what we find, and on what your mother, the trust, and you as trustee ultimately decide to pursue," Nancy said, in the practiced, even voice of someone who has had this exact conversation with 100 other frightened family members. APS's role is to protect your mother going forward and to determine whether there's an ongoing risk. Whether your family pursues restitution, a civil claim through the trust, or criminal charges through the district attorney's office, that is a separate track, and largely up to you and your attorney. I want you to know you have options here, Marianne. This does not have to end any one particular way, but it does have to end with your mother safe. I appreciated that more than I expected to. Some part of me, even sitting on top of $118,400 of documented deception, still did not want my sister in handcuffs. I did not want Ashlyn to grow up with a mother who had a criminal record. I wanted, more than anything, the thing my father had actually built that trust to accomplish in the first place. My mother, safe, cared for, dignified, for however many years she had left. Everything else, I told myself in that quiet week of preparation, was secondary. That did not mean there would be no consequences. It meant, simply, that the consequences I was building toward were designed around protection, not punishment for its own sake. My mother's safety first, restitution second. Public reckoning, if it came, only because Deb herself had chosen, for 3 straight weeks, to make her most aggressive demand yet on the loudest possible stage, in front of the largest possible audience, at a party she had already told half the neighborhood about. The second thing happening quietly during those 3 weeks was the Fairhaven deposit. Rosalind helped me draft a formal letter on the trust's letterhead, authorizing an emergency release of funds to secure my mother's spot in the expanded memory care wing. $22,000, paid in full, 4 days after that freezing rain hallway conversation with Renata. I did this before I told a single other person in the family, because whatever else happened in the weeks ahead, my mother's place in that facility was never going to be a bargaining chip, a threat, or a casualty of a family conflict she did not fully understand. I remember calling Renata to confirm the deposit had cleared, and hearing the genuine relief in her voice, the relief of someone who deals with families in crisis every single day and does not always get to see the resolution land cleanly. "She'll have her spot," Renata told me, "whenever she's ready for it." The third thing happening quietly, the one I am least proud of in terms of how long it took me to notice, involved Dylan. I called him on a Wednesday evening, ostensibly to ask if he wanted to grab dinner before his shift at the hardware store where he had started working part-time, in the same building, under new ownership now, where his grandfather had once run Callaway Supply. We sat in a booth at a diner 2 towns over from where anyone in our family would recognize us, and I watched my 19-year-old nephew turn a paper napkin into a small, tight, anxious accordion while I asked him, as gently as I knew how, about the couch. "I don't know anything," he said first, the reflexive answer of a kid who has spent years protecting his mother's version of events without fully understanding why. Then, after a long silence, after I told him, carefully, without accusation, some small piece of what I had found, his shoulders dropped in a way that told me he had been carrying something heavy for a very long time and had simply never had anywhere to set it down. "Dad lost his job 14 months ago," Dylan said quietly. "The whole department got cut. He's been doing freelance stuff, but it's nowhere near what he made before. Mom didn't want anyone to know. She kept saying things were fine. She kept buying things like things were fine. I think she thought if she just kept spending the same way, it would stay true." I sat with that for a long moment, feeling the shape of the entire 3-year pattern rearrange itself slightly in my understanding. It did not excuse a single forged signature. It did not return $1 to my mother's care fund. But it explained, in the plain, human way that explanations sometimes arrive too late to matter, why my sister had reached, again and again, for a well she had convinced herself was bottomless, and more importantly, hers by right. "Does your dad know you know?" I asked. Dylan shook his head. "I don't think Dad knows how much of it came from Grandma's trust. I think he thinks Mom's got some kind of separate savings. I don't think he knows about the forms, Aunt Mari. I really don't." I believed him, and I filed that belief away, carefully, because it would matter later, when the moment came to decide exactly how wide the collapse needed to spread, and who among the people standing near my sister that night actually deserved to be caught in it, and who did not. "I need you to do one thing for me," I told Dylan, and I want to be honest that I hesitated before asking it, because I did not want to put a 19-year-old in the position of choosing between his mother and his grandmother in any way that felt like a betrayal rather than a rescue. "I need you to be at the party. That's all. I am not asking you to say anything or do anything or take any side out loud. I just need you there, because whatever happens, I do not want you finding out secondhand." Dylan looked at me across that diner table for a long moment, 19 years old and somehow, in that moment, older than that. "Grandpa used to say you always saw what was actually there," he said. "I heard him say it once, when I was a kid. I didn't get it then." He paused. "I think I get it now." I did not tell him everything that night. I did not tell him the number, $118,400, because some numbers are too heavy to hand a teenager over diner coffee. But I told him enough, and I watched something settle in him, a kind of quiet, sad relief. The relief of a person who has spent over a year suspecting a truth, and finally has someone else confirm he was not imagining it. He was, from that dinner forward, an ally in the only way that mattered. Not a spy, not a weapon, simply someone who would be standing in that ballroom on the night everything came apart, so that when it did, my mother would not be the only person in that room who actually loved her, and Ashlyn would not be the only young person in that room who had done absolutely nothing to deserve what her mother's choices were about to cost her. By the second week of preparation, Rosalind, Nancy Ruiz, Dr. Osei, and I had assembled what Rosalind called, with the dry precision of a woman who had clearly done this before, a complete file. 6 forged reimbursement forms, side by side with authentic signature samples spanning 15 years, 3 years of bank statements with every questionable transaction highlighted, cross-referenced against caregiver logs, medical appointment calendars, and vendor delivery records. Dr. Osei's cognitive assessment, dated and signed. A letter from Nancy Ruiz's office confirming an open Adult Protective Services case, and a formal notice drafted by Rosalind that I would need to deliver at the moment I chose to act, revoking Deb's authorized user status on the trust account, effective immediately, along with a demand for restitution of the full $118,400 to be repaid according to a schedule the trust's attorney would propose. "You do not have to do this at the party," Rosalind reminded me, more than once during those final preparation weeks. "You could do this quietly on a Tuesday afternoon in my office with just the two of you and me and a box of tissues, and no one else in this family would ever need to know the details." I understood what she was offering me: a private ending, a dignified, contained resolution that would spare Deb public humiliation, spare Ashlyn the memory of her own birthday party becoming the scene of her mother's collapse, spare the extended family the spectacle that a public reckoning would inevitably become. I thought about that option seriously, more than once, sitting alone at my kitchen table at night with the file spread out in front of me like a hand of cards I had finally, after 3 years, learned how to actually read. Part of me wanted the quiet version. Part of me is, at heart, still the woman who absorbed insults at Thanksgiving rather than make anyone uncomfortable. And that part of me wanted, even now, to protect my sister from the full weight of what she had built. But there was another part of me, quieter and colder and, I have come to believe, more honest, that understood something Rosalind herself had said to me weeks earlier, almost in passing. Deb had spent 3 years building an entire public narrative, at every family gathering, in front of every relative who would listen, in which I was the withholding one, the cold one, the sister who did not understand family, who hoarded money that belonged to everyone, who made people beg for what was rightfully theirs. She had built that narrative in public, deliberately, repeatedly, in front of witnesses, because a public narrative is harder to argue against than a private one. Every insult delivered at a dinner table in front of 6 relatives was a brick in a wall she was building, brick by brick, so that if I ever did act, I would already look, to everyone watching, exactly like the villain she had spent 3 years describing. I decided, somewhere around the second week of that quiet preparation, that the correction needed to happen in the same place the accusation had been built. Not out of cruelty, out of necessity. A private resolution would leave Deb's public narrative fully intact, would leave every relative who had ever heard her call me the spinster who has nothing else to spend her money on, still believing that story, unchallenged, unchanged, for years to come. My mother's dignity mattered more to me than almost anything in this world, and I want to be honest that I built real safeguards specifically to protect it, safeguards I will tell you about shortly. But my own name, the reputation I had quietly, patiently allowed my sister to erode in front of our entire family for 3 decades, deserved a correction delivered where the damage had actually been done. Ashlyn's party was set for a Saturday evening at Birchwood Manor, the same rented ballroom Deb had described in such loving detail at that final family dinner, exactly 17 days after that freezing rain hallway conversation at Fairhaven. 7 days before the party, Deb texted me again about the $7,200, her patience visibly thinning with each message. "The final payment is due Wednesday," she wrote. "I need confirmation the wire is going through." I typed back 4 words. "I am handling it." It was, in its own carefully worded way, entirely true. 4 days before the party, I called Mr. Pace at Meridian Trust, the same banker I had spoken to briefly weeks earlier in that rainstorm parking lot after the initial restaurant dinner. though that first call had only frozen the card temporarily for a routine security review, buying me the time I needed without alerting my sister that anything larger was coming. This second call was different. This was the real one. I gave Mr. Pace the full instruction Rosalind and I had drafted together. Permanent revocation of all authorized user access on the Trust's linked accounts, effective the moment I gave the final word, with formal written notice to follow. "I understand, Miss Calloway," Mr. Pace said, in the calm, unhurried voice bankers develop after years of handling exactly this kind of family situation. "Just say the word, and it is done within the hour." 3 days before the party, I sat with my mother in her living room on an afternoon when she was mercifully sharp and present, and I told her, gently, plainly, without drama, most of what I had found. I want to tell you honestly that this was the hardest conversation of the entire ordeal, harder than anything that happened later in that ballroom, because I was not simply informing a trustee's beneficiary of a financial irregularity. I was telling a mother that one of her 2 daughters had forged her signature repeatedly to take money meant to keep her safe. My mother sat very still while I spoke, her hands folded in her lap, the faint tremor from her stroke visible in her fingers. When I finished, she was quiet for a long moment, longer than I expected, and I watched her face move through something complicated, grief and disbelief and, underneath both of those, a kind of weary recognition, as if some part of her had known, in the vague, unformed way that mothers sometimes know things about their children they cannot quite let themselves fully see. "I signed some papers," she said finally, quietly. "I do not remember what they were for. Deborah said it was for the house." "I know, Mom," I said. "I know you didn't understand what they were." "Am I going to lose my place at Fairhaven?" my mother asked, and the fear in that question, the fear of an elderly woman who has already lost so much of her own certainty about the world, undid something in me that I had kept carefully sealed for 3 straight weeks of clinical, methodical preparation. "No," I told her, taking her hand, the one with the tremor, holding it steady between both of mine. "Your spot is already secured. It was secured 2 weeks ago. You are safe, Mom. That was never going to be a question." She cried a little then, quietly, the way she cried at things now, briefly and without the full force grief used to carry when she was younger. And I held her hand and did not rush her. And eventually, she asked me the question I had been dreading most. "What happens to Deborah?" "I don't know yet," I told her honestly. "That depends on some things. But I promise you, whatever happens, it will not be because I wanted to hurt her. It will be because I have a job to do, and the job is protecting you." My mother nodded slowly, and then she said something that I have carried with me every single day since, something I did not expect from a woman whose memory had become, in so many other ways, a house with half its rooms gone dark. "Your father always said you were the one who could see what was actually there," she said. I think I understood, for the first time, sitting on that floor with you just now, what he meant. 2 days before the party, Nancy Ruiz called to tell me that APS's preliminary findings, combined with Dr. Osei's cognitive assessment and the documentation Rosalind and I had provided, were sufficient to formally substantiate a case of financial exploitation of a vulnerable adult, and that her office would be forwarding the file to the district attorney's elder abuse unit for review, a process that would take weeks, possibly longer, and would ultimately determine whether criminal charges were pursued alongside whatever civil restitution the trust sought. She told me this matter-of-factly, the way professionals learn to deliver heavy news without either minimizing or dramatizing it, and I remember thanking her and then sitting in my car in a grocery store parking lot for a long while afterward, processing the fact that my sister's fate was no longer, strictly speaking, entirely in my hands. I had started something that now had its own momentum, moving through channels far larger and more official than one family's private grievance. One day before the party, I packed the folder. I want to describe this physically because the physical act of it mattered to me in a way I had not expected. Rosalind had prepared everything in triplicate, organized in a slim black leather folder with tabbed sections: the signature comparisons, the transaction analysis, the medical assessment, the formal notice of revocation, and a proposed restitution schedule. I set that folder on my kitchen table the night before Ashlyn's Sweet 16, and I sat looking at it for a long time, the way you look at a door you know you are about to walk through. I thought about my father, in that wood-paneled office, saying I saw what was actually there. I thought about Dylan's quiet, careful text messages over more than a year: new couch, no other context, trying in the only way he knew how to hand me a truth he did not yet have words for. I thought about my mother's hand, trembling slightly under mine, asking whether she was going to lose her place at Fairhaven. I thought about a shoebox of receipts and 6 forged signatures with a C that closed at the top instead of opening the way my mother's real, generous handwriting always had. And I thought about a restaurant table, weeks earlier, and 5 words I had said before walking out into a parking lot slick with the season's first storm. I will call you tomorrow. Tomorrow, as it turned out, had taken 3 weeks, but it had finally arrived. I closed the folder, set it by my front door so I would not forget it, and went to bed early because I understood, lying awake in the dark for a while before sleep finally came, that the next evening was going to require every ounce of the composure I had spent 3 decades learning to hold on to, and I intended to use every bit of it. Birchwood Manor's main ballroom had been transformed for Ashlyn's 16th birthday into something that looked, I will admit, genuinely lovely. Strings of warm gold lights crossed the ceiling in soft arcs. A dessert table held a 3-tier cake iced in blush and cream, flanked by a chocolate fountain that had already drawn a small cluster of Ashlyn's friends before the party had even officially started. A DJ booth sat at one end of the room, speakers humming with a low bass line beneath the general murmur of maybe 80 guests, family, neighbors, Ashlyn's entire circle of friends from school, all gathered under those warm gold lights on a crisp November evening. I arrived at 7, deliberately early, wearing a simple tailored charcoal dress I had bought for exactly this evening. Understated, precise, nothing my sister would have chosen for herself, and nothing she would have expected from me either. A departure from the soft, forgettable cardigans I had worn to every family gathering for years. The wardrobe of a woman who did not want to be looked at too closely. Tonight, I wanted, for the first time in longer than I could remember, to be looked at exactly as closely as anyone cared to look. Dylan found me near the entrance, before I had even taken off my coat. "She's already stressed," he said quietly, glancing toward the ballroom floor where I could see Deb, in a floor-length emerald gown, diamond earrings catching the gold lights, moving between clusters of guests with the bright, brittle energy of a hostess determined to project perfection. "The caterer's been asking about the final balance all day. She keeps telling them it's handled." "It is handled," I said. "Just not the way she thinks." Dylan's eyes searched my face for a moment, and I watched him decide, visibly, not to ask me anything further. He simply nodded, once, and went to find his grandmother, who had arrived a half-hour earlier in a wheelchair pushed by her caregiver, dressed carefully in a soft blue dress Deb had, to her credit, chosen with genuine thoughtfulness that afternoon. I want to be fair to my sister here, even now, even after everything. She loved her daughter. She loved our mother, too. In the tangled, complicated way people love family members, they have also, somewhere along the line, decided they are entitled to take from. None of what happened that night was about erasing that love. It was about ending what she had built on top of it. My mother caught my eye from across the room and gave me a small, private nod. The nod of someone who knew, in whatever way her fading memory allowed her to hold on to things now, that tonight was not an ordinary party. Deb spotted me around 8, as the DJ shifted from background music into something louder, more danceable, clearing space on the floor for the first round of games Deb had planned. She crossed the room toward me with the particular brightness she reserved for moments when she needed something and wanted witnesses to see her ask for it graciously. "Mari!" She kissed the air near my cheek, her diamond earring swinging. "You look nice. Very sharp." A beat, her eyes flicking briefly, assessingly over the charcoal dress, before her real purpose surfaced, as it always did underneath the pleasantries. "Did the wire go through? The caterer's balance is due tonight, and I told them we were confirmed." "We need to talk," I said quietly. "Somewhere private. Now, before the cake. Mari, it is my daughter's 16th birthday. Whatever it is, it can wait an hour." "It cannot," I said, and something in my voice, some quality it had never carried before in 30 years of conversations between us, made her pause, made the bright, performative smile falter at its edges for just a moment before she caught it and pulled it back into place. "Fine," she said, glancing around at the nearby guests with a tight little laugh. "Whatever this is, make it quick." We stepped into a small anteroom just off the main ballroom, originally set up as a coat check, quiet enough that the music from the DJ booth became a muffled thrum through the wall, rather than a wash of sound in our ears. I had asked Rosalind weeks earlier whether I should have her physically present for this moment, and we had decided together that I did not need a lawyer standing beside me in that room. I needed only the folder in my hands and the 3 years of preparation that had gone into everything inside it. "The caterer's balance," I said, setting the folder on a small table between us, "is not going to be paid from the trust. Not tonight. Not ever again." Deb's face went through several expressions in quick succession. Confusion, irritation, and then, when I did not immediately soften my tone the way I always had before, something closer to alarm. "What are you talking about? I already told them we were confirmed. Mari, you cannot do this to me right now, tonight, in front of everyone." "I am not doing anything to you tonight that you did not already do to yourself 3 years ago," I said. I opened the folder. "I want to walk you through this moment carefully, because it is the moment 3 weeks of quiet, disciplined preparation had been built toward, and I had promised myself, lying awake the night before, that I would deliver it exactly the way Rosalind and I had planned, calmly, factually, without a single raised word, because raising my voice would have been, in that moment, a gift to my sister. An excuse for her to reframe everything that followed as an unhinged outburst rather than what it actually was. 6 reimbursement forms, I said, laying them on the table one by one. each one bearing Mom's signature. Except it is not her signature, Deb. It is a close copy. Close enough to fool a bank teller for 3 seconds. Not close enough to fool me, because I have watched Mom sign her name for 50 years, and her real signature has never once closed the top of that C. Deb stared down at the forms, and I watched the color drain from her face in real time, the way blood drains from a hand you have been sitting on too long. Slow at first, and then all at once. I don't know what you're talking about. $118,400, I continued, laying the summary spreadsheet beside the forms. Documented, over 3 years. A vacation to Cancun, billed as respite care coordination. A leased SUV, billed as medical transport. A sofa, delivered to your address, billed as a plumbing emergency at Mom's house. Private tutoring for Ashlyn, billed using language copied almost word for word from an occupational therapy invoice submitted the same month. That's not... Deb's voice had lost its bright hostess register entirely now, thin and fast. You don't understand the context, Mari. There were things happening. Grant lost his... I know about Grant's job, I said quietly, and watched something in her face crack open at that. The specific horror of learning that a secret you have spent over a year protecting has already been fully exposed to the last person you wanted to know it. I know a lot of things now, Deb. I know Mom's spot at Fairhaven almost fell through because the deposit had never been paid, thanks to money that should have covered it instead going toward things that had nothing to do with her care. I know Dr. Osei has completed a cognitive assessment confirming that Mom does not have the capacity to reliably understand or consent to complex reimbursement requests, which matters quite a lot when 6 of them bear a signature that is not actually hers. And I know that Adult Protective Services opened a case 3 weeks ago, and that their file has already gone to the district attorney's elder abuse unit for review. The word district attorney did something to my sister's face that I will remember for the rest of my life. It was not the flush of anger I had expected, the anger she wielded so easily and so often across 30 years of family gatherings. It was something closer to the color draining entirely out of a person, the way a light goes out, not by being switched off, but by simply losing its source of power. "You called the police on me," she whispered. "I did not call anyone," I said, and I kept my voice level because this distinction mattered and I needed her, and everyone who would eventually hear this story to understand it clearly. Your mother's physician is a mandated reporter under state law. Once I told him what I had found, he was legally required to report it. That is not something I did to you, Deb. That is a consequence of what you did to Mom. Deb's hands were shaking now, and she reached for the edge of the small table as if she needed something solid to hold on to. "You froze the card," she said, a realization arriving late, tumbling out almost involuntarily. "That's why the caterer said the payment bounced this afternoon. That's why the florist called about the final balance. You froze the trust card." "I revoked your authorized user access 3 days ago," I confirmed, "as is entirely within my authority as sole trustee. I gave notice to the bank. Formal written notice is being delivered to you tonight, along with a demand for restitution of the full amount, on a schedule our attorney will propose." "Tonight," Deb repeated, her voice barely audible now. "You are doing this tonight, at my daughter's birthday party." I felt something in my chest at that, something that was not quite guilt but sat close enough to it that I had to steady myself before I answered. "I offered myself the option of doing this quietly, Deb, in Rosalind's office on a Tuesday, just the 2 of us. I considered it seriously. But you built a public story about me at every single family dinner for 3 years. You called me a spinster with nothing else to spend her money on in front of Mom, in front of Dylan, in front of Grant, in front of relatives who now believe that story about me because you told it to them, over and over, while quietly forging our mother's signature behind the scenes. I am not ending this in public because I want to humiliate you. I am ending it in public because you are the one who built the audience. Deb opened her mouth to respond, and it was in that exact moment, with almost theatrical timing that I promise you I did not orchestrate, that the anteroom door opened and the events manager for Birchwood Manor stepped in, apologetic, holding a small card reader. "I'm so sorry to interrupt," the woman said, glancing between us with the practiced discomfort of someone who has walked into 100 family tensions at 100 other events. "The catering balance still isn't clearing. I have the caterer out front and he says he needs payment before dessert service begins, or he'll have to hold the cake." The room went very quiet. Deb looked at me, and for the first time in 30 years, I watched my sister look at me not with entitlement, not with the bright, brittle certainty that I would always eventually solve the problem for her, but with something that looked unmistakably like fear. I did not solve it, not the way she wanted. I reached into my bag and handed the events manager my own personal card. "Put $600 on this," I said, "for the cake and the dessert table only, nothing else." The events manager blinked, clearly unused to this particular resolution to a family standoff, but took the card and left without further comment. I turned back to my sister. "That was for Ashlyn," I said, "not for you." Deb had started crying by then, silent tears that she wiped away quickly, angrily, the way a woman cries when she is furious at herself for crying in front of someone she has spent decades believing was beneath her. "What happens now?" she said. "What happens to me?" "That depends on several things," I said. "It depends on Nancy Ruiz's office and the district attorney. It depends on whether you cooperate fully with the restitution schedule Rosalind is proposing. It depends on whether you tell Mom the truth yourself, tonight, instead of me having to be the one who did it 3 days ago. And it depends," I added more quietly, "on whether you are willing to stand in front of this family and let the truth exist for once, instead of building one more story." "You want me to confess, in there, in front of everyone." "I want you to stop making other people carry the weight of what you did," I said. "Whether that happens quietly, tonight, in a way that lets your daughter still enjoy the rest of her party, or whether it happens the hard way, because you refuse and I have no choice but to make an announcement myself, is entirely up to you." I watched my sister, in the span of about 90 seconds, move through denial, panic, and something that finally, mercifully, resembled the beginning of accountability, though I want to be honest that it did not arrive gracefully, and it did not arrive quickly, and there would be several more collapses before the night was over. But that was the moment, standing in a repurposed coat check room with gold light and muffled bass thrumming through the wall, that the woman who had spent 30 years assuming my compliance finally understood, completely and without any remaining doubt, that the sister she had built her entire narrative on top of was not the sister standing in front of her now. She had no idea, walking back out into that ballroom a few minutes later, exactly how the rest of the night was going to unfold. Deb did not confess that night the way I had hoped she might, quietly, with some measure of dignity intact, standing beside me in front of a smaller, gentler audience than the one that eventually gathered. Instead, she did what people cornered by their own choices so often do. She tried to get ahead of the story by telling a different one. I want to walk through what happened next carefully, because the next 40 minutes at Birchwood Manor became, without my planning it this way, exactly the kind of public reckoning my sister had spent 3 years building the conditions for. One insult at a time, one dinner table at a time, without ever imagining that the audience she had assembled might one day witness the opposite of what she intended. She walked back into that ballroom with her mascara repaired, her bright hostess smile reassembled, and within minutes she had pulled her mother-in-law, Grant's mother Patricia, a sharp, opinionated woman who had never particularly liked me, into a corner near the dessert table. I did not hear the exact words Deb used, but I watched Patricia's face shift from polite interest to open hostility, and I understood, watching that shift happen in real time across the room, exactly what story Deb had decided to tell first. Patricia found me by the drink table 12 minutes later, drink in hand, chin raised in the particular way certain women raise their chins when they believe they are about to deliver a devastating blow. "Deborah tells me you are trying to steal from your own mother's trust," Patricia said, loud enough that several nearby guests turned. "That you have been mismanaging funds for years, and now that Deborah finally caught you, you are trying to frame her to cover your own tracks." I felt the old instinct rise in me immediately. The instinct to shrink, to smooth this over quietly, to protect the peace of the party rather than defend myself in front of 80 people at my niece's Sweet 16. I want to be honest that I felt it, because I think it matters for you to understand that even after 3 weeks of disciplined preparation, even holding a folder full of forged signatures and bank statements, the old muscle memory of absorbing an insult for the sake of everyone else's comfort did not simply disappear overnight. But I had spent 3 years building something sturdier than muscle memory. I had spent 3 years building proof. "That's an interesting accusation," I said, keeping my voice level, pitched just loud enough to carry to the small cluster of guests who had already gathered, drawn by Patricia's raised voice, the way people are always drawn to the smell of a fight. "Would you like to see the actual documentation? Or would you prefer to keep repeating whatever Deborah just told you?" Patricia's chin stayed raised, but something flickered behind her eyes, the first small crack of uncertainty. "I would like to see it, actually," she said, with less conviction than a moment before. I did not open the folder there, at the drink table, in front of a dozen half-interested party guests holding paper plates of chocolate-dipped strawberries. That was not the moment I had planned for, and I was not going to let Patricia's interruption dictate the terms of how this unfolded. Instead, I said something I had rehearsed, in one form or another, in my kitchen at midnight, more times than I would like to admit. "In about 15 minutes, once the cake has been cut, I am going to say a few words to this family," I said, loud enough now that I intended it to carry, watching heads turn along the length of the dessert table. "Everyone here is welcome to stay and hear the actual facts, or to go on repeating whatever version they have already been told. I would only ask that whichever you choose it after you have heard both." I walked away before Patricia could respond, my heart pounding harder than my voice had let on, and found Rosalind, who had arrived quietly 20 minutes earlier as I had asked her to, standing near the edge of the room in a plain navy suit, entirely unremarkable among the party guests, except to the one person in that ballroom who knew exactly who she was and exactly what her presence meant. "She's telling people I stole from Mom," I told Rosalind quietly. "I expected she might," Rosalind said, unbothered, the calm of a professional who had clearly watched this exact defensive maneuver play out in other families, other rooms, other years. Panic makes people reach for whatever story gets them through the next 5 minutes. It rarely holds up longer than that. She was right, though the next 15 minutes felt considerably longer than 15 minutes to me. Standing near the edge of that gold-lit ballroom, watching my sister move from cluster to cluster of guests, her voice pitched low and urgent, her hands animated in the particular way hands move when a person is building a defense in real time, rather than reciting one they have already rehearsed. I watched Grant intercept her at one point, pulling her aside, his face a mixture of confusion and something that looked, from across the room, uncomfortably close to dawning recognition, as if pieces of a puzzle he had never quite let himself assemble were suddenly arranging themselves in front of him without his permission. Ashlyn, meanwhile, remained blessedly unaware near the DJ booth, laughing with a cluster of friends, entirely absorbed in the specific, precious obliviousness of a 16-year-old at her own birthday party. And I want to tell you honestly that watching her laugh over there, untouched for now by the storm building around the edges of her own celebration, was the single hardest part of the entire evening for me. Whatever else happened that night, I had promised myself, lying awake the night before, that Ashlyn would come out the other side of it knowing, without question, that none of this had ever been about her. The DJ, on Rosalind's quiet coordination with the venue's events manager, paused the music at exactly 9:15 for the cake cutting, and Deb, visibly rattled but still performing the role of gracious hostess with the particular stubbornness of a woman refusing to let her own unraveling show on camera, stepped up to the microphone to say a few words before the cake was brought out. I had not planned to take that microphone from her. I want to be honest about that because it would be easy in the retelling to make this sound like a calculated ambush, timed perfectly for maximum humiliation. It was not. What actually happened was smaller, and in some ways stranger, and entirely unplanned. Deb, 3 sentences into a wobbling toast about how proud she was of her daughter, about how fast 16 years had gone, stopped mid-sentence, microphone still in hand, and looked directly at me across the room. I do not know to this day exactly what she saw in my expression that made her stop. Perhaps nothing at all. Perhaps only her own guilt finally catching up with her in front of the one audience she had spent 3 years cultivating. "I need to say something else first," she said into the microphone, her voice cracking slightly, and the room, which had been settling into the comfortable murmur of a crowd expecting a sweet, forgettable toast, went abruptly and completely silent. I felt Rosalind's hand find my elbow, a small, steadying gesture, and I understood, standing there, that whatever was about to happen next was no longer entirely in my control, and had perhaps never fully been in my control from the moment Deb first grabbed that microphone. "Some of you have heard things tonight," Deb continued, and her eyes were shining now, whether with genuine remorse or simple panic I could not yet tell, and would spend a long time afterward trying to sort out. "About me, about the trust, about Mari." She paused, and in that pause I watched 80 people, including my own mother in her wheelchair near the front, including Dylan standing tense beside her, including Grant frozen near the bar with an expression I could not read from that distance, wait for whatever she said next to determine, once and for all, which story about our family was actually true. "I want to say," Deb went on, her voice unsteady, "that Mari has always been generous with this family, more generous than I ever gave her credit for." A long breath. "And that some of what I said about her over the years was not fair." It was, I recognized even as I stood there listening, a confession built entirely around softening the blow to herself. It admitted nothing specific. It named no forged signature, no siphoned dollar, no missed care deposit at Fairhaven. It was, in the end, exactly the kind of story my sister had always been best at telling. A story engineered to make the audience feel that fairness had been restored, without actually requiring her to describe what she had done. I understood in that moment that if I let her stop there, if I let that half-confession stand as the final version of this story, my mother's actual danger would disappear into vague, comfortable language about old family unfairness, and Deb would walk away from this ballroom having performed just enough contrition to preserve her standing with everyone watching, while the real facts, the 6 forged signatures, the $118,400, the deposit that nearly lapsed at Fairhaven, would remain buried in a folder that most of these 80 guests would never actually see. I walked forward. I did not take the microphone from her hand. I stood beside her, close enough that she could see the folder I was now holding, and I said, quietly enough that only she and the nearest few rows of guests could hear at first, though it hardly mattered, because the whole room had gone so still that my voice carried anyway. "Would you like me to say the rest, or would you like to?" Deb looked at me for a long moment, and something passed between us in that look that 30 years of family dinners had never quite allowed. Something that was not quite forgiveness and not quite surrender, but sat somewhere adjacent to both. She lowered the microphone slightly, and then, in a voice much smaller than the one she had used to demand $7,200 at that restaurant weeks earlier, she said the words I genuinely had not expected to hear that night, or possibly ever. "Say the rest." I took the microphone. I have thought many times since about what I actually said in that ballroom, standing beside my sister with a folder of forged signatures in my hand and 80 guests, including my own mother, watching in absolute silence. I did not shout. I did not perform outrage for the crowd, though I understood, even as I spoke, that a crowd was exactly what I now had. I spoke the way I had spoken to Deb in that anteroom an hour earlier. Level, factual, unhurried. Because I had learned over 3 years of preparation that facts delivered calmly land with far more weight than facts delivered as accusation. For 3 years, I said, our Mother's Care Trust has been used to fund vacations, a leased vehicle, furniture, and private tutoring, none of which had anything to do with her actual care. 6 reimbursement requests submitted to the bank carried a signature made to look like hers. It is not hers. Her real signature has an open loop at the top of the C. This one is closed. I know that because I have watched her sign her name for 50 years, and because her physician has confirmed in a formal written assessment that she does not currently have the capacity to reliably understand or consent to complex financial requests of this kind. The silence in that ballroom had a texture to it I had never experienced before. A silence made of 80 people holding their breath at once. I could see Patricia near the dessert table, her earlier chin-raised certainty gone entirely from her face. I could see Grant, both hands braced against the bar now, staring at his wife with an expression that told me, more clearly than any words could have, that Dylan had been right, that Grant had genuinely not known the scale of what had actually been done in our mother's name. The amount, I continued, documented over 3 years, totals $118,400. As sole trustee, I have revoked all authorized access to those funds, effective 3 days ago. Adult Protective Services opened an investigation 3 weeks ago, based on our mother's physician's mandatory report. That file has been referred to the District Attorney's Elder Abuse Unit. I heard someone near the back of the room gasp softly, and I saw my mother in her wheelchair near the front reach for Dylan's hand. And I saw Dylan take it and hold it steady, the same way I had held her hand 3 days earlier in her living room. I am telling you this tonight, I said, and here my voice, for the first time in the entire speech, softened slightly. Because this next part was not for the crowd. This next part was the actual point. Because for 3 years, at nearly every gathering this family has held, I have been called cold, withholding, a spinster with nothing else to spend her money on. Those words were used to explain why I hesitated on occasion before releasing funds. I want everyone in this room to understand now exactly why I hesitated. A short pause. Because I was the only person checking whether the story matched the numbers, and it did not. I looked at my sister then, standing beside me, tears streaking her carefully done makeup, and I said the last line I had prepared, the one Rosalind and I had discussed at length weeks earlier, deciding together whether it belonged in this speech at all, and deciding, ultimately, that it did, because it was the one sentence that turned 3 years of a cruel, careless phrase into something my sister would never be able to use against me again. You told me, more than once, that being the one who makes things easy is what I am for, I said, turning to face her directly now, my voice quiet, but carrying clearly across that silent ballroom. You were right. That is exactly what I am for. Making sure Mom is safe. Making sure the truth does not disappear into a nicer-sounding story. Making sure the people who actually need protecting get it, even when protecting them means an uncomfortable conversation at a party. I set the microphone down. I did not wait for applause, because this was not a performance built for applause, and none came. Only that same held, textured silence, the silence of 80 people recalibrating, in real time, everything they thought they understood about two sisters they had known for years. My sister stood beside me, and for a long moment, in front of everyone, she did not say anything at all. The moments immediately following that speech unfolded with a strange, suspended slowness, the kind of slowness I imagine people describe after a car accident, when time seems to stretch and compress at once, every small detail sharpened, while the larger sequence of events blurs into something you can only reconstruct afterward, piece by piece. Deb cried, openly now, no longer bothering to wipe the tears away or protect her makeup, standing in her floor-length emerald gown in the middle of a ballroom she had booked to celebrate her daughter, having just watched her entire, carefully constructed reputation dissolve in front of 80 witnesses in under 4 minutes. I want to tell you that I felt triumphant in that moment, because a version of this story, the version my sister might have expected me to want, would have me standing there glowing with vindication, finally, after 30 years, watching her get exactly what she deserved. That is not what I felt. What I felt, watching my sister cry in front of her daughter's friends and our extended family, was something far more complicated. A grief that ran underneath the vindication like a current beneath still water. I had loved my sister once, in the uncomplicated way children love each other before family stories calcify into cages. Some small part of that love had never fully died, even after 3 years of forged signatures and 30 years of casual cruelty. And watching her collapse in that ballroom did not erase that part of me. It simply sat alongside everything else, uncomfortable and undeniable. Grant crossed the room first, before anyone else moved, his face pale, his voice, when he reached her, low enough that I could not hear the exact words, but could read, easily enough, the shape of the question in his posture. How much? How long? Why didn't you tell me? Deb answered him in fragments I caught only partially. Something about the tuition, something about not wanting him to worry on top of the job, something about thinking she could pay it back before anyone noticed. Patricia, to her credit, did not come find me to apologize immediately, though she would, weeks later, in a stilted, awkward phone call that I accepted graciously because there was no benefit to either of us in prolonging that particular grudge. In the ballroom itself, she simply stood very still near the dessert table, her earlier certainty replaced by the specific, uncomfortable stillness of a woman realizing she had picked the wrong side loudly and publicly, with witnesses. My mother, in her wheelchair, beckoned me over with a small motion of her hand, and I crossed the room to kneel beside her, taking the hand Dylan had been holding a moment before. "You did the right thing," my mother said quietly, her voice steady in a way that told me this was one of her clear moments. The fog temporarily lifted, and I will always be grateful that it happened to lift during exactly this conversation. Your father would be proud of you, not for the money, for seeing it, for not letting it go on. I'm sorry it had to happen here, I told her. Tonight was supposed to be about Ashlyn. My mother glanced across the room to where Ashlyn stood frozen near the DJ booth, her friends around her gone quiet and uncertain, clearly having heard at least the broad strokes of what had just been said. Her 16-year-old face caught somewhere between confusion and a dawning, painful understanding that something enormous had just happened at her own birthday party. Go to her, my mother said. She needs you more than I do right now. I crossed the ballroom floor, aware of eyes following me, aware that I was, for perhaps the first time in my adult life, the person every single relative in that room was watching most closely, and I found that I did not shrink from it the way I once would have. I simply walked, in my tailored charcoal dress, through a crowd that parted slightly to let me pass, the way crowds part for someone whose business is suddenly, unmistakably, their own to attend to. Ashlyn, I said, reaching her, and I watched her eyes fill with tears the moment I said her name, the particular tears of a teenager trying very hard to hold something together in front of her friends. This has nothing to do with you. I need you to hear that clearly. Nothing that happened tonight is your fault, and nothing that happens next is going to take away who you are to this family. Is it true? Ashlyn asked, quietly, her voice small in a way that made her sound, for a moment, much younger than 16. What you said, about the money. It's true, I said. I did not lie to her because she deserved, at 16, the same respect for the truth that I had spent 3 years insisting my mother receive. But it is not your money, and it was never your fault, and I promise you, whatever happens with your parents in the weeks ahead, you are not going to lose this family. You are not going to lose me. She hugged me then, hard, the way Dylan had hugged me at his grandfather's funeral years earlier, and I held my niece in the middle of a ballroom full of stunned party guests, gold lights still strung overhead, an untouched 3-tier cake still sitting on its table, and I understood, holding her, that whatever this evening cost my sister, whatever it cost me in terms of the family peace I had spent 30 years protecting at my own expense, this moment, this exact moment, was worth every bit of discomfort it had taken to arrive at it. The party did not end abruptly, though I want to be honest that it never fully recovered its earlier festive energy either. The DJ, at Rosalind's quiet suggestion, resumed a softer playlist. The cake was cut, eventually, by Ashlyn herself, with visible effort to smile for the sake of her younger cousins and friends, who did not fully understand what had just happened, but understood enough to know that something serious had. Deb did not leave the party, though I understand, from Dylan later, that it took everything she had to stay through the final hour rather than flee. Grant stayed beside her, silent, his expression unreadable, though I noticed, near the end of the night, his hand resting briefly on her shoulder. Not quite an embrace, but not nothing either. I left Birchwood Manor a little after 11 that night, Rosalind walking me to my car under a clear, cold sky, the storm from weeks earlier long since past, the air carrying that particular sharp, clean smell that comes after rain has finally cleared out of a region for good. You handled that better than most people would have, Rosalind said, as I unlocked my car. Most people, once they finally get the microphone, cannot resist making it worse than it needs to be. I thought about making it worse, I admitted, for about 3 years, if I am honest. Rosalind smiled, the small, tired smile of a woman who had clearly watched a lot of families reach exactly this kind of breaking point. The restitution paperwork will be ready Monday, she said. We will let the DA's office move at their own pace. Whatever happens on that front is largely out of your hands now. And honestly, out of hers, too. I drove home that night with the radio off, the folder sitting on the passenger seat where it had sat, unopened after that ballroom, for the rest of the evening. And I found that the quiet in that car did not feel empty the way silence used to feel after difficult family gatherings for most of my adult life. It felt, instead, like the particular quiet that comes after a long, necessary storm has finally, completely passed. I want to tell you what happened in the weeks and months that followed, because a story like this does not actually end the moment the microphone gets set down, no matter how satisfying that particular scene might feel in the retelling. Real consequences take longer to settle than a single dramatic evening. And I think the truth of what happened afterward matters more than the drama of what happened that night. The district attorney's elder abuse unit reviewed Nancy Ruiz's file over the following 6 weeks. I learned, through Rosalind, that prosecutors in cases like this often weigh several factors before deciding whether to pursue criminal charges against a family member. The age and vulnerability of the victim, the scale of the financial harm, whether restitution is being made voluntarily, and whether the family itself wishes to pursue a criminal track or resolve the matter civilly through the trust. My mother, when Rosalind and I sat down with her to explain the options available, was clear about what she wanted. In one of the sharpest, most decisive moments I had seen from her in over a year. "I do not want my grandchildren visiting their mother in prison," she said. "I want my money back, and I want it to never happen again. That is all I want." That clarity, delivered by the person who had actually been harmed, carried enormous weight with the district attorney's office. Rosalind negotiated, over the following 2 months, a resolution that avoided criminal prosecution in exchange for a formal, court-monitored restitution agreement. Full repayment of the $118,400 over a period of 6 years, secured against Deb and Grant's home equity, with mandatory financial counseling and a legally binding acknowledgement of the forged signatures entered into the record, which meant, practically speaking, that if my sister ever violated the agreement, the criminal referral could be reopened immediately, without a fresh investigation required. It was not, in the end, the cinematic collapse some part of me, in the angriest weeks of that autumn, had half wanted. There were no handcuffs, no courtroom drama with reporters outside. There was, instead, something slower, and in some ways harder for my sister to bear. 6 years of monthly payments, a permanent legal record of what she had done, mandatory sessions with a financial counselor who, according to Dylan, made her review every single receipt from those 3 years out loud, one by one, in a small office with fluorescent lighting and no audience at all to perform for. Grant, I learned, took a second job within a month of that party, not because the restitution required it directly, but because, in his words to Dylan, he needed to be part of fixing this, not just watching someone else's spreadsheet fix it. He and Deb are still married, as of the writing of this account, though Dylan tells me the marriage carries a different weight now, quieter, more careful, the particular carefulness of 2 people rebuilding trust from a foundation that cracked more badly than either of them had let themselves admit before that November night. Deb and I do not have the relationship we once had, and I want to be honest that I do not know whether we ever fully will again. She called me 3 weeks after the party, in a voice smaller than I had heard from her in 30 years, and apologized, specifically and in detail, for the first time in her life, naming each thing she had done rather than gesturing vaguely at some of what I said not being fair. I accepted the apology. I did not, and have not, extended full trust back to her, because trust, I have learned, is not something you owe a person simply because they have finally, belatedly, told you the truth. It is something rebuilt slowly, through years of consistent, demonstrated change, the same slow way my father built a hardware store out of a cinder block building and Saturday deliveries. We speak now, occasionally, mostly through logistics involving our mother's care, and once, at Ashlyn's request, at a smaller, quieter family dinner 6 months later, where nobody demanded anything of me, and nobody called me a spinster, and Deb, when she passed the breadbasket down the table, simply said, "Thank you, Mari," in a tone that held none of the old performance in it at all. Ashlyn, I am relieved to tell you, came through that night better than any of us had reason to expect. She spent that Christmas with me for an entire weekend, the first time in years she had visited without her parents present, and we talked, over hot chocolate in my kitchen, about college applications, and about her parents' marriage counseling, and about the particular, complicated grief of loving people who have disappointed you without stopping loving them entirely. She is 17 now, sharp and observant in a way that reminds me, more than I expected, of myself at that age, and she has told me, more than once, that she intends to study accounting. So nobody can ever lie to me with a spreadsheet the way my mom almost got away with. I did not push her toward that decision. I simply told her, the way my own father once told me, that numbers, unlike people, never lie about what actually happened. They only wait for someone patient enough to ask them the right question. Dylan graduated from his community college program that following spring, and he works now at Meridian Trust, of all places, training under Mr. Pace, learning the exact kind of careful, unglamorous work that protects families like ours before the damage gets as deep as ours did. He told me, at his graduation, that he wanted to be the kind of person who notices the couch, the kind of person who asks the second question instead of letting the first easy answer stand. I have never been prouder of anyone in my life who was not, biologically, mine. My mother moved into her expanded care wing at Fairhaven the following spring, in a bright room with a window that looks out over a small courtyard garden, fully funded, fully secure, with a trust now overseen not just by me, but by a court-appointed co-trustee Rosalind helped arrange, a professional fiduciary whose sole job is reviewing every distribution alongside me, a safeguard we built specifically so that no single person, myself included, ever again holds unilateral, unwitnessed control over that money. I want to be honest that suggesting that safeguard myself, insisting on shared oversight even though I was the one who had done nothing wrong, felt strange at first, almost unfair. But I understood, thinking it through with Rosalind, that the entire crisis had grown out of a system with too much trust and too little verification, and that the correction needed to address the system, not just the person who had abused it. My mother, in her clearer weeks, still occasionally reaches for my hand and tells me I did the right thing. And in her foggier weeks, she simply smiles at me the way she always has, uncomplicated, warm, unaware for a few hours at a time of the particular battle her two daughters fought to protect her. And I find, strangely, that I am grateful for both kinds of weeks in their own way. As for me, I want to tell you something honestly, because I think it matters more than the satisfying details of restitution schedules and forged signatures ever could. For 30 years, I built my entire sense of worth around being useful, being the reliable one, being the one who did not need celebrating because she was simply, quietly, always there, absorbing whatever the family needed absorbed so that everyone else's story could stay comfortable. I called that humility for a long time. I called it being the bigger person. It took losing sight of my own mother's safety buried under 3 years of someone else's careless spending, for me to understand that what I had actually been calling humility was something closer to disappearance. I do not disappear anymore. Not at family dinners, not in boardrooms with a bank officer, not standing in front of 80 guests at a ballroom holding a folder of evidence I had spent 3 weeks quietly assembling. I still do not raise my voice. I do not think I ever will, not really, because I have learned that a level voice, backed by actual documentation, carries further and lands harder than any amount of shouting ever could. If you have ever sat at a family table absorbing an insult because keeping the peace felt easier than being believed, I want you to hear this clearly. The story other people tell about you, the cold one, the difficult one, the spinster with nothing else to spend her money on, is not the truth about who you are. It is only the story that was most convenient for them to tell. You are allowed to correct it. You are allowed to correct it in the same room where it was built, in front of the same people who believed it. And you are allowed to do that calmly, without becoming the villain they always claimed you were. The people who count on your silence are rarely as careful with the truth as you are. That is not a weakness in you. It is, in the end, the only advantage you will ever actually need. My father used to say that a business built on honest numbers could survive almost anything: storms, recessions, bad years, so long as the books themselves never lied. I think the same is true of a life. Mine survived 30 years of being underestimated because the numbers, when someone finally checked them, told the truth I had been too tired, too grieving, and too afraid of conflict to speak out loud myself. I do not know what your particular version of that shoebox looks like. Maybe it is a will nobody has read closely enough. Maybe it is a signature that does not quite match. Maybe it is simply a sentence someone has said to you so many times that you stopped hearing it as an insult and started believing it as a fact about yourself. Whatever it is, I hope you go looking for the truth underneath it, the way I finally did, on an ordinary Sunday afternoon, looking for an insurance card in a hallway closet. I hope, if you have ever had to stand up to your own family the way I did, that you know it does not have to look like screaming. And it does not have to look like cruelty. It can look exactly like a level voice, a folder of facts, and one phone call made quietly in a rainstorm by a woman everyone assumed would always say yes. Have you ever had a moment like that in your own family? A moment where you finally stopped absorbing the story someone else was telling about you and told the truth instead? I would love to hear it. Share your story in the comments below, and if this one meant something to you, I would be grateful if you would like this video and subscribe for more stories just like it. Because somewhere out there tonight, there is another woman sitting at another dinner table, being told exactly what she is for. I hope, when her moment comes, she remembers that she gets to decide that for herself.